You never forget the sound of dirt landing on someone you love. Not when you're 10 years old, hiding in the trees, watching your father dig a grave for your older brother who still had breath left in his chest. The thud of each shovelful was like thunder in my ears, like the world was being buried with him. That memory is etched into the marrow of my bones, no matter how many years have passed. And now, at 78 with shaky hands and a worn heart, I believe it's time to tell it all. Not just for my brother, but for anyone who's ever survived what should have ended them. My name is Shelby Hansen, and I was born in 1947 in the rugged hills outside Bisbee, Arizona. These days, my mornings start with trembling fingers and the stubborn struggle of memory. Sometimes, I stand in the kitchen, staring at the old kettle, trying to remember if I've already boiled the water or why I walked in there in the first place. The doctors say it's normal for someone my age, but not everything fades. No, some things stay sharp, cutting through the fog of time with terrifying clarity. Some memories become part of you, not like stories tucked in photo albums or names written on old postcards, but like fire burned into your soul. There's one memory, in particular, that never let go. I've carried it like a stone in my chest for nearly 7 decades. I used to think I could forget it, bury it, like we buried so much in those days. But secrets rot when kept underground, and some deserve sunlight. It was the summer of 1957. I was 10 years old, and my brother, Caleb, had just turned 13. Back then, we lived on the edge of town in a battered old ranch house, just past the copper mining roads. Folks called our place the Dust Bowl because nothing ever seemed to grow there except maybe pain. Our family was poor, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was our father, Jeremiah Hansen, a man whose presence was like a storm cloud that never moved. He drank more whiskey than he ever brought home food. When he walked through the door, we held our breath. He wasn't loud like some drunks. He was quiet in that dangerous kind of way, the kind where his silence meant tension, winding tight, waiting to snap. And when it did, the belt came off, sometimes his fists, and always the fear followed. Mama, Margaret, tried to keep peace in the house. She wore long sleeves in the summer and lied to the neighbors with a smile so brittle you could see it cracking. She made cornbread and beans stretch through the week, patched our clothes, and whispered prayers at night when she thought no one was listening. But I always heard. So did Caleb. We heard everything. Caleb was my whole world. He was tough, wild in a good way, with a grin that made you forget just how hard our lives were. He'd take the worst of Daddy's moods to protect me, get between the belt and my skin, the fist in Mama's face. He was only a boy, but in my eyes, he was a warrior. That summer, the heat sat heavy on our roof, and the sky seemed to press down on us like it wanted to crush us flat. That was the season when everything shattered, the season when my brother, my best friend, my shield was nearly lost forever, and it all started with a bowl of cold beans. I've carried this story in silence for far too long. I used to wonder if telling it would bring pain back to life. But now I believe something else, something Caleb taught me with the way he lived after everything was taken from him. Pain doesn't die in silence. It festers. And sometimes the only way to heal is to drag it, screaming, into the light. So, if you're still with me, lean in close. What I'm about to tell you isn't fiction. It's not some horror novel or dusty myth from the Old West. It happened right here in the sun-scorched dirt of Arizona, and it started with a man, a son, and a shovel. This is our truth, and this is where it begins. Bisbee in the 1950s wasn't like the postcard towns you see in old movies. It was a dusty skeleton of its mining glory, weather-worn and stubborn. The houses were perched on dry hills, like tired dogs too old to move. Our house was one of them, a leaning shack of sun-bleached wood and rusted nails, tucked behind a crooked barbed wire fence. If you squinted, you could almost pretend it had once been something grand. But even as a child, I knew better. That house held more ghosts than furniture. Daddy had inherited the land from his father, and I think he hated it because it reminded him of where he came from. He hated everything, really. The sun, the noise of the wind, the cluck of our chickens, Mama's voice when it trembled, and he especially hated Caleb. I never asked why. I don't think Daddy knew himself, but it was as if Caleb represented something he couldn't control. Caleb was bold, quick-witted, and unafraid to speak when something was wrong. And in a house ruled by fear, that was dangerous. I remember one afternoon, maybe a week before, everything broke. Caleb patched a hole in my shoe, using an old tire patch and some twine. I wore those shoes until the sole wore out completely, but I kept them long after, just because he'd touched them. Mama saw the shoes and said, "Your brother's got hands like your grandpa. Make something out of nothing." She smiled, then just a flicker, but it was the kind of smile I didn't see often. We didn't have much. A cow so thin you could count her ribs, 6 chickens, a garden that only seemed to grow weeds. But Mama still tried to make it a home. She sang hymns while hanging laundry, braided my hair with gentle hands, and cooked what little we had like. It was a feast. But no matter how hard she tried, the shadows always came back. And when they did, they wore Daddy's face. His name was Jeremiah Hansen, and he was the kind of man folks in town didn't ask questions about. They knew better. He walked into that local tavern, and people looked away. There were rumors. A man in a bar fight gone wrong, a neighbor's dog gone missing. But no one said anything, because Daddy knew how to make people disappear, not physically, maybe, but emotionally. With enough cruelty, even a child could vanish inside herself. Mama, though, she endured. I never knew how she did it. She moved like smoke through that house, graceful, but fading. She had deep eyes, the kind that looked like they once held laughter, but had since drowned in silence. Her hands were always working kneading dough, sewing Caleb's shirts, washing blood from her own lip in the bathroom sink while humming Amazing Grace. And Caleb, he saw it all. He watched the bruises. He heard the sobs. And each time, he swore quietly under his breath, "Someday, I'll stop him. Someday, this ends." I don't think Daddy noticed the rebellion growing in Caleb, or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it, thinking brute force would snuff it out like it had with Mama. But Caleb wasn't like her. He wasn't born to survive quietly. He was born to resist. The summer of '57 came in blazing and dry, the kind of heat that baked the ground until it cracked and sucked the green out of every living thing. It was the summer Caleb started working with old man Richie down at the scrapyard, earning 50 cents a day and a sandwich for lunch. He gave half the coins to Mama and kept the rest in a tin box under our bed. "I'm saving up," he told me one night while we lay under the stars. "One day I'll buy a bus ticket out of here. I'll take you and Mama somewhere with water, with trees." "But what about Daddy?" I asked. He went quiet for a long time. Then, in the softest voice, he said, "One way or another, he's not coming with us." At 10, I didn't understand what that meant. Not really, but I knew enough to keep my mouth shut. That same week, Daddy started drinking heavier. He'd always come back from town with liquor on his breath, but now the bottle stayed in his coat, even when he was home. He drank before sunrise. He drank after dinner. His eyes were red and wild, more often than not, and the belt came out more regularly. Caleb began sleeping with his boots on. Mama started stashing food, and I started praying. Not the bedtime kind, but the real kind. The kind where you don't even speak, just beg the sky with your whole body. Looking back now, it feels like the world knew something was coming. The animals were restless. Even the air felt heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath. And then came that one afternoon, the day the sun refused to blink, the day the cornbread went cold before Daddy arrived, the day Caleb stood up and shouted, "That's enough," the day everything changed. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the heat sat over Bisbee like a curse. The air shimmered off the dusty ground, and inside our wooden house, everything was quiet except the ticking of the old wall clock and the gentle clink of Mama's spoon as she stirred a pot of beans. She'd made cornbread, too, crisp around the edges, soft in the center. Caleb's favorite. It was one of those rare days when she seemed hopeful, maybe because Daddy had been gone since dawn. Maybe she thought he'd stayed in town to sleep off his anger. She was wrong. He burst through the door just as the light outside turned gold, the sun leaning westward. I'll never forget the sound of that screen door slamming against the wall like a gunshot. He staggered in, drunker than I'd ever seen him. His shirt was stained with sweat and liquor. His machete, the one he always brought when he went to work, swung from his belt. The room dropped 10 degrees in seconds. Mama's back stiffened as she turned from the stove. Caleb stood at the table, hands clenched at his sides. Jeremiah looked around with that glazed-over, mean look that always came before the storm. He sniffed, like he could smell weakness. Then he slurred. "Cold food again. You waiting for royalty." Mama tried to answer, but her voice cracked. "It's still warm. Just come sit." But he didn't sit. Instead, he lunged. The plate flew off the table, shattering on the floor. Beans and cornbread splattered across Mama's dress, and that's when Caleb stepped forward. His voice came out deeper than usual, stronger. "That's enough." Pa. The room went still. Daddy turned, slow like a rattlesnake, eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" "Boy, I said stop hitting her. It's cowardly." For a heartbeat, no one moved. I could hear the blood in my ears, feel the tremble in my knees. Caleb stood between Daddy and Mama, chin lifted. I'd never seen him look more like a man than in that moment. But Daddy, he snapped. With one motion, he swung his fist into Caleb's face so hard I heard the crack of bone. Caleb dropped, knees buckling, but he didn't stay down. He wiped the blood from his mouth and rose again, fists clenched. He charged. What followed wasn't a fair fight. Caleb was just 13, wiry from hunger and farm chores. Daddy was a full-grown man, fueled by whiskey and rage. He hit Caleb with his fists, with the belt, with the handle of the machete. Mama screamed. I screamed. But our voices might as well have been wind. I saw Caleb fall a second time, this time not moving. His chest barely rose. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. His left eye was swollen shut, and his shirt was torn open. Daddy stood over him, panting, soaked in sweat. He nudged Caleb's side with the toe of his boot. No response. He whispered to himself, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Damn, I killed him." And that's when I wet myself. Fear, pure and hot, flooded me. My little body couldn't contain it. I stood frozen in the corner as Mama collapsed over Caleb's body, sobbing his name, but Daddy grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her off like she was a rag doll. Then he looked at me. Just for a second, our eyes locked, and I saw it, Not remorse, not shock, just calculation. He turned and went outside. Seconds later, he returned with a shovel. Without a word, he bent down, scooped Caleb into his arms like a sack of feed, and walked out the door toward the woods. Mama cried after him, crawling to the doorway. I followed him, quiet, barefoot, still trembling. I didn't know what I was doing, just that Caleb couldn't be alone. Not like that. I stayed hidden in the scrub as Daddy walked into the trees, deeper than we'd ever been allowed to go. He picked a spot under an old mesquite tree and started digging. Each strike of the shovel sent up a puff of red dirt. I clutched the rosary Mama gave me and mouthed prayers I barely remembered. When the hole was wide enough, he dropped Caleb in like trash, and then Caleb moved, a twitch, barely visible, but enough. His chest rose. A soft moan escaped his lips. I bit my hand to keep from crying out. Daddy didn't notice, or maybe he did and didn't care. He picked up the shovel and began covering him with dirt, and that's when the miracle happened. A sound came from beyond the clearing, the sharp, startled snort of a horse. Through the trees came a man on horseback, Zeke Morrison, our reclusive neighbor who lived 2 miles east, alone since his wife died. He'd been riding the trail, maybe hunting, maybe just passing through, but he saw it. He saw my father burying his own son. Zeke didn't say a word. He waited, watched. Only after Daddy walked away, muttering, dragging the shovel behind him, did Zeke dismount and rush forward. I broke from my hiding place and ran to him, crying, "He's alive, Zeke. He's alive." Zeke didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, started digging with his bare hands, and unearthed Caleb from the shallow grave. My brother was barely breathing, his face streaked with dirt and blood, his lips blue, his pulse weak. Zeke lifted him into his arms and turned to me. "Come on, girl. We're not staying here." We climbed onto his horse. Caleb draped over the saddle, me clinging to Zeke's waist, and rode into the dusk. That was the last time I saw our house standing. It was also the first time I knew monsters didn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they sleep in the room down the hall. The ride to Zeke's cabin felt like an eternity. The path was rocky, winding between shadows of mesquite and cottonwood trees, and each jolt of the horse made my stomach twist. Caleb lay draped across the saddle in front of us, his arms hanging limp, his face so pale I kept checking to make sure he was still breathing. Every few seconds, Zeke would glance down at him, his weathered face grim and tight. Neither of us spoke. Even the woods seemed hushed, like they knew something unholy had happened among them. The wind didn't whistle, the birds didn't sing. There was only the steady clop of hooves and the cracking of dry branches underfoot. Zeke's cabin came into view just as the sun kissed the horizon, an old one-room place tucked into the hillside, mostly hidden by trees and rock. The logs were sun-bleached, the porch sagging on one side, but it looked like the safest place in the world to me. He slid off the horse with practiced ease and lifted Caleb down as if he were made of glass. "Stay close to me, Shelby," he said gently, nudging the cabin door open with his shoulder. Inside, the room was dim and smelled of smoke, pine sap, and dried herbs. A single oil lamp flickered to life as Zeke struck a match and lit the wick. Its glow spilled over a modest space, a cot in the corner, a table littered with mason jars, and shelves lined with dusty books and canning supplies. Everything was old but clean, lived in, steady. Zeke laid Caleb on the cot and peeled off his shirt, revealing a canvas of bruises, dark purple, angry red, streaks of brownish yellow, where old wounds were healing. His ribs poked through his skin, and his lips were cracked and dry. I need water. And that rag there, Zeke instructed. I jumped to help, grateful to do anything at all. He worked quietly, wiping blood from Caleb's face, checking his pulse, prying his eyelids open to check his pupils. He's alive. Barely. But the boy's hanging on. I choked on a sob. Is he going to die? Zeke looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something behind his tired eyes afire. Not if I can help it. He moved like a man who'd done this before. Every gesture was purposeful, every supply precisely where it needed to be. He mixed crushed herbs into hot water, spooned a few drops between Caleb's lips, and covered him with a wool blanket. I sat on the floor beside the cot, holding Caleb's hand. It was so cold it scared me. I whispered little things to him, memories, jokes, whatever came to mind, as if my voice could coax him back from wherever he was drifting. Hours passed, maybe more. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was wrapped in another blanket, and Zeke was sitting in the chair across from me, nursing a cup of coffee. You can sleep here tonight, he said. You're not going back to that house. I looked at him. What about Mama? Your Mama's strong, but she can't protect you, not from him. Right now, your safety comes first. My throat burned. He'll come looking for us. Zeke nodded slowly. Maybe, but not tonight. He thinks Caleb's dead. He thinks you're too scared to do anything. That gives us time. His voice was calm, but firm, like a man who had seen evil and refused to bow to it. That night, I slept on the floor beside Caleb's cot. I didn't close my eyes much. I kept waking to check his chest, to see it rise and fall, to hear the raspy whistle of his breath. Zeke paced the cabin every hour, checking Caleb's temperature, cleaning his cuts, whispering words I couldn't hear. And for the first time in my short life, I felt something I didn't recognize right away. It was safety. It came not from walls or locks, but from a man who didn't raise his hand when he was angry, who didn't use silence as punishment, who didn't flinch when a child cried. In the morning, light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, golden and quiet. Caleb hadn't woken yet, but his color was a little better. His fingers twitched when I squeezed his hand. Zeke was outside grinding coffee beans with hands that looked like they'd worked 100 harvests. He poured me a cup, bitter and strong, and handed me a slice of cornbread. Eat. You need strength. I sipped slowly. My hand still shook. What happens now? I asked. Zeke looked at me for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the horizon. Now we wait. Let your brother heal. Then we decide how to fight back. I stared at him, surprised. Fight back. He met my eyes. You think what your daddy did is something you just walk away from. He buried his own son alive. Shelby, that's not something you forget. And it sure as hell isn't something we let slide. A lump formed in my throat, but he's our father. Zeke set his mug down gently. There's the man who fathers you, and there's the man who raises his hand against you. Those aren't always the same person, and only one of them deserves your loyalty. His words carved themselves into me, line by line. Over the next few days, Zeke taught me how to brew healing teas, how to wash wounds without hurting them, and how to boil water over a fire without burning the pot. He showed me how to stay busy, not because it distracted me, but because it gave me something to control when everything else felt like quicksand. Caleb stirred for the first time on the 5th morning. I was rinsing a bowl outside when I heard a raspy whisper. Where am I? I dropped everything and ran inside. He was blinking slowly, his lips cracked, voice weak. You're safe. I said, throwing my arms around him gently. You're with Zeke. He saved you. He looked confused, scared. Where's Pa gone? He thinks you're dead. Caleb turned away, his eyes dull. Good. That word so small, so heavy, hung between us like smoke. I wanted to say something to make it better, but I didn't, because it wasn't better. Not yet. But he was alive, and that was enough to keep hoping. Zeke always said that healing didn't come like lightning, it came slow, like sap from an old tree, sticky, uneven, and sometimes it hurt more than the wound itself. Caleb's body healed faster than his mind. Within a week, he could sit up in bed and take sips of broth. By the second week, he stood, leaning on Zeke's shoulder for support, his legs shaky like a newborn foal. But the light in his eyes, that spark I remembered from before, stayed dim. He barely spoke. When he did, it was clipped and cold. The Caleb I knew, the one who used to chase jackrabbits through the hills and whistle at the stars, was still in there somewhere. But he was buried beneath layers of pain and rage, just like he'd been buried under that dirt. Zeke didn't push him. He was patient, the way a good man is with broken things. He'd talk about the weather, the land, the crops, never about what happened, until Caleb brought it up. It was a Tuesday, just after supper. We were sitting around Zeke's wooden table, me, with my chin in my hands, Caleb picking at a piece of dry bread. Zeke was whittling something by the window. Caleb's voice cut through the silence. When are we going to the sheriff? Zeke didn't look up. When you're strong enough. I'm ready, Caleb said, sharper this time. I'm alive. He needs to pay. Zeke set the carving knife down slowly and turned. He will, but we don't go in hot. We go in right. You want justice, not revenge. I want both, Caleb snapped. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Zeke leaned forward, his voice steady. And you'll get it, but we do it smart. You think that sheriff's gonna believe two kids without proof. Your daddy's a known drunk, but people still fear him. We need your story to be clear. We need it written down. You want me to write? Caleb laughed bitterly. With what, Zeke stood up, walked to a small drawer near the hearth, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook and a stubby pencil. He placed them in front of Caleb. With this, write everything, every hit, every word, every step. I stared at the notebook like it was sacred. Zeke looked at me. You too, Shelby. Your voice matters. What you saw matters. I hesitated. I don't remember everything. Not perfectly. No one does, he said. But you remember how it felt. That's just as important. So that night, we began. Caleb wrote with trembling hands. I helped where I could. We took turns, one of us writing, the other keeping watch by the door, just in case the past came knocking. Some nights we cried. Others we stayed silent for hours, letting the pages speak. Zeke helped us organize the words, made sure the timeline made sense. A testimony without structure is just noise, he'd say, and slowly, our pain became paragraphs, our fear became sentences. What we had endured, what we had survived, took shape on those pages. It was during one of those writing nights that Caleb said something I'll never forget. You hate him too, don't you? I froze. I didn't know how to answer. I don't know if I hate him, I whispered, but I'm not afraid of him anymore. He looked down at his lap. I do hate him for what he did to me, to Mama, to you. He stole our childhood. I wrapped my arms around his thin frame. His shoulder blades stuck out like wings that had never been allowed to grow. You weren't born to hate, I whispered. Don't let that become your story. He didn't respond, but that night I heard him cry in his sleep, and when I tried to hold his hand, he grabbed mine so tightly I thought he might break it. Days passed like that. Zeke would go into town for supplies, always returning with small treasures, a sack of flour, a bar of soap, a hard candy for each of us. He never said whether he'd seen our parents. I didn't ask. Then, one morning, he came back and set his hat down slowly. His face looked more worn than usual. "I went by your place," he said, sipping from a tin mug. "Your mama's still there." My heart stopped. "Is she okay?" "She's standing. That's the best I can say. But she doesn't know where you are." "Far as she knows, you ran off to your aunt's. She believes your daddy buried Caleb behind the house." I swallowed hard, and Pa Zeke's eyes darkened, walking around like nothing happened, quiet, like a man waiting for his past to find him. Caleb's voice came low. "He thinks I'm dead." Zeke nodded, and that's our advantage. He doesn't suspect, which gives us time. Time to plan. Time to build a case. Caleb looked down at the notebook. "Then we better finish writing." That afternoon, we did just that. We filled every page. Caleb described the blows, the hole, the dirt on his face. I wrote about the ride into the woods, the way Daddy whispered, "I killed him," like it was just another chore. And then we signed our names. Zeke signed too, as witness, as rescuer. It was the first time I saw Caleb stand tall since the day he was buried. He closed the notebook, looked me in the eyes, and said, "He doesn't get to silence us. Not anymore." Later that night, as we prepared to rest, Zeke pulled us aside. "Tomorrow," he said, "we ride into town. We show this to the sheriff. We tell him everything." Caleb didn't flinch, and for the first time in weeks, neither did I. The next morning, Bisbee was quiet under a pale sun. A light breeze rustled through the canyon and over the rooftops like it had no idea what was coming. Zeke saddled his horse before dawn, tying down a burlap sack with the notebooks inside. Caleb wore one of Zeke's old button-up shirts, too big for his frame but clean. I brushed his hair as best I could and braided mine like Mama used to, though my hands trembled the entire time. Zeke looked at us both. "You ready?" Caleb nodded. I did too, though my legs were already shaking. We rode the long way into town, avoiding the trail near our old ranch. Zeke said it was safer that way. The path twisted through dry brush and silent hills until it opened into the back edge of Bisbee's town square. It looked the same as always: post office, general store, the cafe with a crooked sign, but I felt like we were arriving from another world, one that had nearly swallowed us whole. The sheriff's office sat at the corner, squat and sun-faded, with peeling paint and 2 dusty patrol trucks parked out front. Sheriff Raymond Hensley was a man people respected, though few liked. He was fair, but hard, the kind of man who could read lies before they left your mouth. He met us outside, his hat low over his brow, flanked by 2 deputies. One held a clipboard. The other held a holstered revolver with a palm that never seemed to leave the grip. Zeke raised a hand. "Morning." "Sheriff." Hensley nodded slowly. "Heard from a man in town you might be hiding someone out at your place." Zeke didn't flinch. "I've got something you need to see, and a story you'll wish wasn't true." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but he gestured us in. We entered a plain room with a single desk, a few chairs, and a typewriter in the corner. It smelled of dust, old coffee, and worn-out justice. Zeke placed the notebooks on the desk. Caleb stood still, breathing like he was walking into fire. I reached for his hand. He didn't move. Hensley opened the notebooks. He started reading. At first, he kept a steady face, But as the words spilled out about the beating, the shallow grave, the rescue, his expression cracked. His eyes flicked up at Caleb. "This true?" he asked, voice low. Caleb didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, lifted his shirt, and showed the scars along his ribs, across his chest, the still faded bruise behind his ear. "He left me in the ground," Caleb said. "He thought I was dead. But I wasn't," Zeke added. "I saw it all. I stayed hidden when Jeremiah was digging. I waited until he left, and I dug the boy out myself. You'll see my handwriting in the notebook, too." The sheriff looked back down. His jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "If what I'm reading is true, this is attempted murder. It's worse," Caleb said. "It's a lifetime of it. That was just the last time he got caught." The sheriff finally stood. "You'll both need to give formal statements, and I'll need to see those wounds again, officially." Zeke nodded. "Whatever you need. We spent hours at the station. They separated us, first Caleb, then me, then Zeke. Each of us repeated our parts of the story. They typed every word, read them back aloud, asked for clarification. I could barely sit still while they questioned Caleb in the next room. My stomach twisted so tight I thought I'd throw up. But when he came out, he looked different, tired, pale, but firm, like he'd handed off a burden. "They believe us," he said, not long after. One of the deputies returned with a pair of handcuffs and a grim face. "We've got enough," he told Hensley. "Let's go get him." I felt my knees go weak. Zeke placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did good," he said. "We weren't allowed to go with them." "For safety," the sheriff said. So they drove us to a temporary safe house near the edge of town, an old adobe cottage owned by the county, with boarded windows and 2 deputies guarding the porch. We didn't sleep that night. Caleb sat by the window, jaw clenched, eyes on the road. What if he fights? He asked Zeke. Zeke shook his head. He won't. Men like him, when they think no one's watching, they turn into ghosts. And Zeke was right. By sunrise, the patrol returned. Sheriff Hensley stepped out, dust clinging to his boots, face lined with exhaustion. He knocked on the door, removed his hat, and said softly, "We got him." Caleb stood. "Did he say anything?" The sheriff looked at him long and hard. He didn't resist, just sat there drunk, muttering. "When we told him you were alive, he went quiet, said, 'I thought he was dead.' That's all." I felt the air leave my chest. Caleb didn't say a word. His face didn't move. But something in him, some heavy, tight knot, finally seemed to loosen. "He's in custody at Cedar Creek." The sheriff continued. "He won't be seeing sunlight anytime soon." Zeke thanked the sheriff. So did I. But Caleb just nodded, barely. When the door closed behind us, he whispered, "I never want to see him again." "You won't," the sheriff replied. "You did what you had to do. Now it's our job to carry it from here." That evening, Caleb sat by the window, watching the sunset like it was the first he'd seen in years. Zeke handed him a tin cup of coffee and sat beside him. "How do you feel?" Caleb took a sip, then looked down. "Empty." "That's part of it," Zeke said. "You spent so long surviving. It's strange to just be outside." The wind began to blow. Not angry, not violent, just steady. And for the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel like it was ending. It felt like it was just beginning. The news traveled through Bisbee like a dust storm, fast, gritty, and impossible to ignore. Jeremiah Hansen arrested for attempted murder of his own son. People gossiped in whispers at the general store, behind church pews, on the benches outside the diner. Some said it had to be a mistake. Others, those who knew him a little too well, simply lowered their eyes and muttered, "About time." We were kept in that county safe house for 3 more nights. Sheriff Hensley said it was just precaution, but even as a child, I could see the truth. No one knew what Jeremiah might do next. Not yet. But he never got the chance. On the morning of the 4th day, just after breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Sheriff Hensley stood outside again, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "Kids," he said, "I need you to sit down." My heart stopped. Caleb froze, standing beside the table with his hand gripping the back of a chair. "It's your father," the sheriff said gently. "He's dead." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one breathed. How Caleb asked, barely above a whisper. Sheriff Hensley sighed, pulled off his hat, and sat down across from us. "There was a man in the prison, a long-time inmate. Turns out your father put his brother in a wheelchair 20 years ago in a bar brawl up in Flagstaff. The man never forgot. The other inmates cornered your daddy in the laundry room, beat him bad. He didn't make it. I didn't know how to react. I covered my mouth." Caleb stood perfectly still. Then he said, quietly, "He died without ever saying sorry." The sheriff nodded solemnly. "That's true, but he won't hurt anyone again." Zeke was standing near the window, arms crossed, silent. I think we all expected some kind of relief to come rushing in, some flood of freedom or peace. Instead, there was only a strange quiet. It wasn't joy. It wasn't grief. It was the absence of fear, and that, too, is a kind of ache. That night, we didn't talk much. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window. I laid curled up on my side, listening to the wind push gently at the wooden shutters. It sounded different now, less like a threat, more like a sigh. "Do you miss him?" I asked into the dark. Caleb didn't answer right away. Then finally, "I don't know. I miss what I wished he could have been." I nodded in the silence. I felt the same. The next morning, Mama came. Zeke had arranged it. When she stepped through the door of the safe house, I barely recognized her. Her face looked older, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight she'd carried for years had finally pulled her down. But when she saw us, her face crumpled, and she rushed to us, arms outstretched. "My babies," she cried, "forgive me. I didn't protect you." We held her tight, all 3 of us locked together like a single heart, too long broken. I breathed in the scent of firewood, flour, and salt, Mama's scent, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something warm rise in my chest. Caleb whispered, "It wasn't your fault." "Mama, we stayed that way a long time. No one wanted to let go. Mama stayed with us for a few days in town, and when the sheriff said it was safe, the state offered to relocate us to start over. Zeke helped make the arrangements. We never went back to the ranch. I don't think we ever planned to. Instead, we moved north to a small town called Willowbrook. It was quiet, nestled between green hills and dry creeks, a world away from the red dust of Bisbee. They gave us a little adobe house with a tin roof and a fenced yard where Mama planted beans and wildflowers. She started baking again, real baking this time. She sold cornbread and fruit preserves at the local farmer's market on Sundays. The townsfolk loved her. They called her Ms. Maggie, and she smiled more than I'd ever seen in my life. As for Caleb, something in him began to shift. Slowly, carefully, he wrote every day, filled notebook after notebook with pieces of the past, with poems about the wind, stories about boys who survived darkness and girls who never let go of light. He didn't share them at first. They were just for him, a way of ordering the chaos. But I knew. He was beginning to find himself again. So was I. We'd walked through fire and somehow scarred, yes, but standing we'd made it to the other side, and that was only the beginning. Willowbrook wasn't a perfect town, but it was ours, and after all we'd lived through, that was more than enough. The house the county gave us sat on the edge of town, past the fields of prickly pear and mesquite. It had 2 bedrooms, a tin roof that pinged when it rained, and a front porch that looked out over a yard of red clay and hope. For the first time in years, we had peace. Not silence from fear, but the kind that settles over you like a warm blanket. Mama, Margaret Hanson, to the world, but just Mama to us began to bloom. She made sweet tamales, cactus jelly, and pies that people lined up for at the Sunday market. She walked with her head held higher. Not all the bruises had healed, not the ones under the skin, but she laughed again, and her laughter. It filled our little house like sunlight. Caleb took longer. He didn't speak much those first few months. He spent his time behind the house, beneath the big ocotillo tree, writing in a spiral notebook with a pencil worn to the nub. I'd watch him from the kitchen window sometimes, shoulders hunched, brows furrowed, as if wrangling ghosts onto the page. "What are you writing?" I asked once, handing him a glass of water. He didn't look up, just trying to get the mess out of my head. I nodded. I understood. Sometimes I'd see him rip pages out, crumple them, toss them aside. Other times, he'd sit there still as a stone for hours, pencil unmoving, as if afraid that putting the truth down would make it too real. Then one day, something shifted. It was late autumn. The air was cooler. Mama had sent me to the market, and when I returned, Caleb was sitting at the table with a folded sheet of paper in his hand. His eyes were glassy, his voice barely above a whisper. "I left one of my stories on the school bench by mistake," he said. "The teacher picked it up. He wants me to read it out loud at the community center." I stared at him. "Are you going to do it?" He nodded slowly. "I think I have to." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the wind scratch against the windows, thinking about what it would mean for Caleb to speak, truly speak, about what happened, not just to us, but to anyone who'd ever been silenced by shame or fear. The reading happened the next Friday. They set up a small stage in the community center with folding chairs and a table of lemonade and cookies. The room wasn't full, maybe 20 people, but it felt like standing before a crowd of thousands. Caleb walked to the front, holding his notebook tight, his hands shaking. "My name is Caleb Hanson," he began, voice low but steady. "And when I was 13, my father buried me alive. But this is not just a story about what he did. This is about what happened after." He read for 20 minutes. He told the story from beginning to end, his voice breaking at times, but never stopping. Some people gasped. Some wept silently. A woman in the back held her daughter's hand tight. And when he finished, there was no applause at first, just a silence so deep you could feel it. Then someone stood, then another, and soon the whole room rose to their feet. That was the day Caleb became more than a survivor. He became a storyteller. Word spread. More readings followed. The high school invited him to speak, then the church, then a domestic violence shelter 2 towns over. He never read for fame, never accepted money. He said it wasn't about him, it was about giving voice to those still buried in silence. At home, he was still Caleb, my brother, Mama's son, The boy who once carved a slingshot out of mesquite wood and swore he'd run away to California. But something in him had changed. He stood straighter. He looked people in the eye. The boy who had almost died in the dark now stood in the light and invited others to join him. One day, he handed me a small stack of printed pages. I put them together. He said, "My story. Yours. Zeke's. Mama's. All of it." The title on the front, Buried Alive, A Story of Dirt, Darkness, and the Choice to Rise. I held it in my hands like something sacred. "You should publish this," I whispered. He smiled gently. "I don't want to be famous. I want it to find the people who need it." And it did. We printed 50 copies and placed them at the library, the community center, and the local shelter. Everyone disappeared within a week. A woman stopped us at the store one afternoon, eyes full of tears. "Your words," she told Caleb. "They gave me the courage to leave, to take my kids and go." Caleb didn't say much. He never did in moments like that. But when we walked home that evening, I saw something in his eyes. Not pride, not ego, just quiet strength. The kind that comes from knowing you've taken your pain and turned it into something that might just save someone else. It had been nearly 3 years since we left Bisbee when the letter arrived. I found it tucked between the electricity bill and a seed catalog on the porch. The envelope was cream-colored and soft-edged, addressed in careful handwriting. No return address, but I knew the script immediately. Zeke. I called out to Caleb, who came out wiping flour from his hands he'd been helping Mama with the tamales. He took the envelope, turned it over once in his fingers, then opened it without a word. He read in silence, then handed it to me. Caleb and Shelby. A woman named Ophelia Sutton passed away last month. She lived across from your old house. In her will, she left instructions to notify you both. She claimed your father had left behind a small piece of land, and though nothing legal ever made it official, she believed it belonged to you now. The house is falling in. The mesquite trees have claimed most of it, but the land still gives, if you care to see it one last time. Yours always, Zeke. Caleb looked at me. "I think it's time." I felt something tighten in my chest. That place. It was a wound we had never pressed on again. We'd built so much away from it. Joy, peace, purpose. But still deep down, I knew what Caleb meant. We had to return, not to relive the pain, but to bury it properly. The drive to Bisbee felt surreal. The hills that once towered over us now seemed smaller, less threatening. The road curved like it remembered us, like it had been waiting all this time. Mama came too, though she stayed quiet most of the ride. She held the rosary in her lap, fingers moving slowly over the beads. Every so often, she looked out the window with tears pooling in her eyes, but never falling. When we reached the old ranch, I didn't recognize it at first. The house was no longer a house. It was a skeleton. The roof had collapsed. Vines curled through the broken windows, and the porch slumped like an old man who'd lost his breath. The air smelled of dust, dry grass, and a strange kind of silence. We walked slowly. The three of us stood before what used to be our front door, now splintered and swaying. Mama didn't move past the threshold. Caleb did. He walked straight through, his boots crunching on fallen plaster and old glass. I followed, heart pounding. The kitchen was nothing but a hollow space. But I could still see the outlines in my mind where Mama used to stir the beans, where Caleb patched my shoes, where Daddy once slammed his fist on the table. Memory is cruel like that. It shows you the ghosts even when the bones are gone. I buried myself here, Caleb murmured. I took his hand, but you didn't stay buried. We moved outside, past the brittle corral fence, toward the tree line at the back of the property. There it was, the spot where it had happened. The hole had long since filled in. Nature had erased the grave we couldn't, but we knew. Someone, probably Zeke, had placed a small wooden cross there, weather-worn, simple. It read, "Here, fear died." Caleb sank to his knees in front of it. He didn't cry. He just breathed. Long, deep breaths, like he was finally exhaling something he'd held in since that summer day. Mama approached slowly and placed a small bundle of wildflowers at the base of the cross. Then she whispered a prayer so soft I couldn't catch the words. But I didn't need to. It was a prayer for all the years we didn't get to live freely. A prayer for the little girl who used to hide in the closet. A prayer for the boy who once clawed towards sunlight through layers of dirt. And maybe a prayer for the man who failed them. We spent hours there. Caleb walked through the ruins of the barn. I sifted through what used to be our bedrooms. Mama sat on a rock near the mesquite, letting the wind play with her hair. Before we left, Caleb knelt again, this time with a small jacaranda sapling in his hands. "I brought this from Willowbrook," he said. He dug the hole himself, right next to the old cross. His hands were steady, his movements slow and full of purpose. When he finished, he poured water from a canteen around the roots, then pressed the earth down with his palms. "There," he whispered, "let something beautiful grow where something awful happened." We stood in silence as the wind rustled through the leaves of the young tree. It was barely 2 feet tall, but it stood proud, alive, like us. That night, we stayed at Zeke's. He looked older, more gray in his beard, more lines in his face, but his smile hadn't changed. He poured us coffee and laid out warm bread on the table, like no time had passed. "Returning," he said softly, "doesn't mean staying. It just means you're strong enough to look back without falling apart." We nodded. Before we left the next morning, Caleb handed Zeke a copy of his book. "Thought you should have the first one," he said. Zeke took it with shaking hands. "I always knew you'd rise, son." Caleb smiled. "Thanks to you." As we drove away from Bisbee, I looked back one last time. The land didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt like something else. Not home, exactly, but maybe a place where we left the hurt behind buried. But this time, with a seed planted right on top. The jacaranda tree Caleb planted outside the ruins of our childhood home has grown taller than any of us now. Zeke sends us pictures of it every spring, covered in soft lavender blooms, petals falling like confetti over the hard Arizona ground. He always writes the same thing under each photo: "It took root, like you." And every time, I cry, because what Caleb and I survived was supposed to destroy us. It tried. That place, those hands, those years buried us deep. But we clawed our way back into the light. We didn't just survive. We grew. The years since returning to Bisbee passed like quiet chapters in a peaceful book. Caleb kept writing, but not about pain anymore. His words became softer, braver, more open. He published another book, a collection of poems and letters from children who had come through the Roots Revival Project. He titled it, "We Spoke Anyway." Mama grew older, but her hands never stopped working. She opened a small shop in Willowbrook, selling cornbread, preserves, and cactus honey. She named it Margaret's Table. Every child who walked in left with a story and a sweet. And me, I became a teacher. I work with children who have seen too much and felt too little love. I read to them. I listen. I tell them they matter, that their words matter, that even if the world tries to bury them, they are seeds waiting. Sometimes Caleb visits my classroom. He reads out loud and answers their brave questions. And when one little girl once asked, "Were you scared when they buried you?" he smiled gently and said, "Yes, but I wasn't alone, and neither are you." That, I think, is the greatest truth of all, because no matter how deep the darkness, no matter how heavy the dirt, if even one person reaches in, if even one hand finds yours, you can come back. You can. But coming back is just the first part. The rest is what you choose to do with that second chance. Caleb chose to tell the truth. I chose to teach others how to find their voice. Mama chose to love fiercely and start over, even when her body ached from years of silence. And Zeke chose to see something awful and do something about it. He never called himself a hero, but in our eyes, he always was. I look back now, and I see it all differently. I no longer see that old ranch in Bisbee as a graveyard. I see it as the starting line, the place where the pain ended and the growing began. We don't always get to choose what happens to us, but we do get to choose what we become because of it. You may feel buried right now by shame, by fear, by things you think no one could ever understand. But let me tell you something I've learned after all these years. You are not buried. You are planted. And if you keep reaching toward the light, if you speak, if you fight, if you believe you are worthy of blooming, you will rise. There is strength in survival. But there is even more in choosing to live beyond it. So plant your roots, let them stretch deep and wide. And then, when the time comes, bloom where they tried to break you. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever carried pain in silence or known someone who has, we invite you to share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Let's keep creating a space where healing isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Leave us a comment. Share your reflections, your strength, your questions. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, truth, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind someone else you are not alone, and you were always meant to bloom.